In this episode, we will be discussing types of employment. In Philippine jurisdiction, there are 6 types of employment relationship. The default will be regular employment. It's the default because the other types of employment would require concurrence of certain elements that an employer has to prove so that the employee will not fall under irregular employment. A regular employment in the Philippines are classified into 2: regular employment by nature and regular employment by period. The regular employment by nature is an employee who performs work that is usually necessary or desirable to the usual trade or business of the employer. You memorize that term because that's the exact term used by the statute. A regular employee is an employee who performs work that is usually necessary or desirable to the usual trade or business of the employer. The second type of regular employee is a regular employee by period. These are initially casual employees who perform work for 1 year, whether continuous or broken, and that particular casual employee will attain the status of regular employee by period for that particular activity. As mentioned, a regular employee is the default. Once you engage an individual as an employee without compliance with certain requirements, that particular employee will be considered from day one a regular employee. So, as part of management prerogative, an employer can place a particular individual to a different category of employment relationship as long as certain elements are complied with. For example, an employer can make an individual a probationary employee as long as certain elements are met. The first one, the probationary employment must not exceed 180 days. And second, the reasonable standards for regularization must be made known to the employee at the start of engagement. There are, of course, certain exceptions to the rule. For example, in the rule on 180 days as period for probationary employment. In one case, the Supreme Court held that it is possible for an employer at the outset offer a period longer than 180 days if the employer is able to prove that the nature of the work in assessing the employee, if he will become a regular employee, requires a longer period. In that particular case, the employee was a sales employee, and the company said that it would require an entire year for it to determine whether the employee is fit to be a regular employee, because that employee will have to sell and would have to collect from those sellings for the entire period of 1 year. Hence, a 180-day period in testing the ability of the employee to become a regular employee would not be enough. In that particular case, the Supreme Court agreed that in limited circumstances, the employer may offer a longer period of probationary employment as long as it is absolutely necessary. There is also an understanding that the probationary employment period could not be extended. There is no requirement for an official declaration or official notice coming from the employer that the probationary employee has attained regular status. The attainment of the status of regular employment would be automatic if the employee has rendered service for more than 180 days. The exception to that rule is that the employer and the employee may agree to extend the probationary employment if the extension is an accommodation to the employee or as an act of grace of the employer. For example, in many of the cases, the Supreme Court has allowed extension of probationary employment when that particular probationary employee has already been failing the reasonable standards for regularization, and the employer has allowed the extension so that the employee would have more opportunity to prove his worth or his capacity to become a regular employee. The Supreme Court in that particular case allowed the extension because that extension is actually an accommodation or a favor to the employee. The next type of employment status would be casual employees. Casual employees are those employees that are performing functions that are incidental only to the business of the employer. You will note that this is the reverse of regular employees. If regular employees are performing work that are usually necessary or desirable to the usual trade and business of the employer, casual employees are those who are performing merely incidental functions. For example, if there is a barber shop and the barbers in that barber shop, because they are performing work that are usually necessary or desirable to the usual trade or employer, would most certainly be considered regular employees. But if there is an artist in that barber shop who draw the price list, for example, or the types of haircut in a blackboard, that kind of employment would not be considered a regular employment because that kind of employment is only incidental to the business of a barber shop. In fact, many, if not all, of barber shops will be able to survive that business even without an artist in their employ. The next type of employment is a fixed-term employment. Note that the fixed-term employment is frowned upon by the courts because many say that fixed-term employment might violate the security of tenure of the employee because the employment relationship will end upon expiration of the term, compared to a regular employee who may only be terminated due to just or authorized cause for termination of employment as specifically provided for in the statute books. That is why when the employer proves that the employment relationship is fixed term, the employer is required to prove the elements strictly. And these are, number one, the fixed term employment has been entered into by the employee knowingly and voluntarily. And second, that the employer and employee dealt with each other in approximately the same bargaining position. The next type of employment is seasonal employment. This seasonal employment requires the employer to prove two elements. The first element would be the work must be seasonal in nature, meaning if the work is performed year-round, that could not be considered to be a seasonal in nature. And second, the work of the individual must end at the end of the season, because if the individual is performing work even beyond the season, then that individual will be considered as a regular employee. Note that seasonal workers may also be considered regular seasonal. In the case of Hacienda Bino, the Supreme Court said that if the employer engages an employee, a seasonal employee, for 2 seasons, then that individual will already be considered a regular seasonal, which means that every time the season arrives, and as long as that activity is available in that particular season, the employer is required to engage the services of that regular seasonal individual. There was one case in the Mercado case where seasonal workers filed a case against an employer because they were supposed to be engaged several times, and in the recent season, they were not re-engaged. So they filed an illegal dismissal suit. It was found out that these individuals, even though they were rehired several times, could not be considered regular seasonal because for each of the season, they were not able to complete. Unlike the Hacienda Bino case, the Hacienda in that Mercado case is smaller. So when you combine the doctrines of Hacienda Bino and the Mercado case, a seasonal worker will be considered a regular seasonal if the seasonal employees are engaged 2 or more seasons and that they are performing the work exclusively for a particular employer for the entire period of that season. The next type of employment is project employment. There are also 2 elements for the validity of project employment. The first one is there must be a specific project. And the second one is that specific project must end with a period that is determined or determinable. In other words, if the work performed by the employee is not a project-based, then that supposed project employee will not be considered a project employee, but will be considered a regular employee. In summary, there are several types of employment, such as the regular employment, which is the default. And note that in regular employment, they may only be terminated due to just or authorized cause for termination as enumerated in the labor code. The other types of employment, such as casual, probationary, fixed term, seasonal, and project, are other types of employment, but the employer is required to prove additional elements for them to fall under such category. In these categories, while they also may be terminated due to just or authorized cause for termination, there would be an additional ground for termination, such as, for example, for fixed-term employment, that employment will end at the end of the period. For seasonal employment, that employment will end at the end of the season. Or for probationary employment, in addition to being able to terminate due to just or authorized cause, they may also be terminated for failure to meet the reasonable standards for regularization. In the next episode, we will be discussing the excluded employees under Article 82 of the Labor Code.